I've been doing this work for a long time, but I have to give a shout out to the person who really inspired me with this, which was Paul Kimmel. His book, Men's Work, it's really worth picking up a copy of if you're interested in these sorts of topics. You can also find him online at paulkimmel.com. He's the one who, as far as I'm aware, really formulated the Act Like a Man box exercise, which is the foundation for my experience talking about this stuff. I have also seen it referred to as the man box, but for reasons that I'll get to in a moment, I actually prefer calling it the Act Like a Man box. I think that captures some of the nuances that calling it the man box doesn't really get into. So let me describe what this is. What I learned from Paul, and the way that I have been teaching this for, gosh, almost 20 years now, which makes me feel a lot older than I feel like I should be. It's a brainstorm exercise. And some of you may have done, has anybody ever done this exercise either as a participant or a facilitator? Anybody? All right. Well, if any of you feel inspired to, feel free, but definitely read Paul's book and credit him for it, not me. But the way that it works is it starts off with a brainstorm. And I ask the audience a series of questions. Basically, what does a real man look like? And we're talking about stereotypes. And I ask questions like, what does he look like physically? What does he do for a living? How does he act? What are his relationships like? What's his sex life like? All of these different kinds of questions. And here are some of the words that frequently show up. Not in any particular order, but I will say that when I start off asking what he looks like, the three words that always show up first are tall, big, and strong, or muscular, or buff, or some version of those. This is probably a pretty familiar vision of what men are supposed to be like. Is this not familiar to anybody here? Now, this may not be somebody in your life, or it may be. It may also be something that some of you have struggled with, either for yourself or with a partner, because there's a lot of stuff there. I do want to call out, though, that there's a lot of things in this box that not everybody will resonate with, because we each have our own versions of this box, depending on our own family history and upbringing and culture and religion. So this is really an average. But having said that, I have done this exercise with groups of all different races and genders and ages and sexual orientations, and all across the board, we really get a pretty consistent look at what a real man is supposed to look like. So after we brainstorm this list, I take the box and I draw a box around it. And then I ask the question, what do men get called when we are not all of these things? And here are some of the words that come up. And again, there will be some variation depending on who I'm working with. Some groups are a lot more hesitant to say some of these words, even though I've heard them all before. Most of them have been used at me. These are probably pretty familiar to many of you as well. So we have the inside of the box and the outside of the box. And the thing that I find most fascinating about this is that this box really is an either or. Either you're all the way in or you're all the way out. And I think that says a lot about how we construct gender. I do want to acknowledge that the equivalent box for women used to be just as inflexible. And due to the work over the last century or so, depending on where you start counting from, and due to the efforts of mostly but not entirely women and mostly but not entirely feminists, that box has become much more flexible. It still has its places of rigidity, for sure, but it has become more flexible than it used to be. For some reasons that we'll get into in a few minutes, the box for men is a little slower to change. And so that's part of what is the challenge here. But so when I think of the box, here's how it starts. Anybody here ever seen, or maybe you've done this, or maybe this happened to you when you were a kid? Little kid, he's running down the street or he's playing, and he trips and he falls and he hurts himself and he starts crying. And somebody says, "Why are you crying? I thought you were a big boy." Raise your hand if you've ever seen this happen. Yeah, most folks have. That's the beginning of the box. And this is why I find it so powerful to call it the Act Like a Man box rather than the man box, because it's not about being a man, it's about acting like one. So it's the Act Like a Man box. because we can't do it all the time. Nobody can do it all the time. Get to that in just a moment. So instead what we do is we act like we can, so that you don't know that we're not. That's the big secret of masculinity. Not really a big secret, and yet we don't talk about it too much. The box, though, is pretty much impossible to comply with for a variety of different reasons, and this is another way in which it really hinders and stifles people of all genders, and especially men. One reason why it's impossible to comply is that some of the things in the box are contradictory. For example, for some people, being in the box is having, a career like a doctor or a CEO or a lawyer, somebody where you make a lot of money, in theory at least. And for other folks, the definition of masculinity means you work with your hands, you're a mechanic, you're a firefighter, you're a contractor, that kind of thing. So nobody can do both of those things at the same time. You can't be a car mechanic and a doctor. It just doesn't work. If you think about the ultimate vision of the American dream, though, it was the guy who started off on the factory floor, worked his way all the way up to the top, and then became the owner of the business. That was never very common, ever. It's even less common now because you need to have an MBA and all of this, advanced education to be able to run a business these days. So it's even more rare than it used to be. But I've talked to men who are, lawyers who are convinced that they're not real men because they don't work with their hands. And I've talked to car mechanics who think that they're not real men because they're not rich. So some of the stuff in the box is simply contradictory, and nobody can do all of it at once. Another way in which it's impossible to always be in the box, some of us are physically not ever going to be in the box. I'm 5'6". I'm not ever going to be tall, which means that by some people's definitions, I'm not going to be in the box. Not if your idea of a real man is tall and big and muscular. Just not me. For some people, if you're disabled, you're not in the box. And any of us can become disabled without warning. So, imagine that you have fit in the box your whole life, and then you get in a car accident, and now you're outside the box. And especially if you've had an accident that causes erection difficulties, or paralysis, and you're not as physically mobile as you used to be, what does that do to somebody's self-image? This is part of what hinders healing or recovery from those kinds of events. And for that matter, when I ask people, how old would you say somebody is when they're in the box? What kind of age range would you peg that at?
The age thing actually surprised me the most of everything about the box.
What about it?
That an age range would define a parameter of the box. That would surprise me.
Well, let me ask you all, what age would you describe a real man as?
Under 40.
Under 40? What else?
It speaks to virility.
If you live long enough, you age yourself out of the box, which again is a problem for a lot of men. I've talked with plenty of men who are in their 60s, 70s, 80s, who are starting to have often not even starting to deal with some of the health issues that they're having. They're not as strong as they used to be. They're not as able to do things, and that really challenges them.
I say it's even more difficult navigating through that ageism in the gay community.
Yes.
Because we get from many different sides.
Absolutely. So ageism in the gay community plays out for sure. And a similar kind of thing, although you do get some differences there as well, because in the gay community you also have a valorization of youth, whereas in other communities, it's not until you really hit your adult stride that you become a real man. You're still a kid until whatever age. So that's why I pegged it at 25 to 45. When I do these workshops, I've heard anything between 20 and 50, but 25 to 45 is the most common. But so it's impossible to comply for our whole lives. If we're lucky, we live long enough that we age out of the box. Well, maybe other people might not consider that lucky. I'm hoping to be lucky enough to age myself out of that. But I think this really speaks to why we see so many advertisements on TV for Viagra, for example. Not the only reason, and I think there are some very positive reasons for Viagra and other sorts of medications, but one of the reasons why it became such a big seller is because of that. So it's impossible to comply with the box. And what that means is we have to pretend that we are so that nobody notices that we aren't. And the way that works is we distract you. Or, men distract people. I try not to do this. It's taken me a lot of work to get there, but I can own that. I still sometimes fall into this. It's kind of like the Wizard of Oz. I'm going to try to convince you that I'm the big, scary, floating head over here with the flames and the loud voice so that you don't notice that I'm just some dude behind the curtain. Another way that I think of it is it's like a magician who waves the silk scarf over here so that you don't notice them reaching behind their back. It's a distraction. And so some of the ways that that plays out is men may pick one of those things out of the box that really resonates for them and turn up the volume on that. So maybe I will talk about work all the time, or I will talk about how many sexual conquests I have, or I will obsess about sports or cars. What are some other ways that guys perform this that you can think of?
Penis size.
Penis size, yeah. Bragging about penis size or sexual conquests. What else?
How many women I sleep with?
Uh-huh. Yes, for sure. What else?
Going to the gym.
Going to the gym, being really big and buff. Yeah. What else? What's one more?
Put down other people, call other people something outside of the box.
Yeah, and we'll get to that in just a moment. Put down people who are outside the box. There's all of these different ways that men will perform a piece of it so that you don't notice that we're not all of it. And different folks will do different things. So speaking of outside the box, when I ask folks to give me some words that are outside the box, this is a representative sample of what we get. And I've noticed a few things about these words. One is that they always fit into one of three categories. Either you are gay, you are female, or you are a loser, which I think says some pretty telling things about sexism and homophobia. In my view, sexism and homophobia are the bricks that make up the box, and shame is the mortar that holds it all together. Because that's really what we're talking about here. This gets shamed into us from a very young age. And outside the box is a scary place to be, so it's no wonder that so many men invest so much time and energy into not being out there, because that's scary. That's a scary place to be, for a lot of different reasons. And so what happens is the box becomes both a performance and a hierarchy. So what do I mean by performance? Well, gender is something that we perform. I do believe that there is a piece of it that is essential to our individual biologies. I've seen too many people have different shifts in hormones because of health issues or medications or aging or menopause or pregnancy or any of these other things for me to believe that gender is entirely a social construct. I just don't. I don't believe anything is entirely a social construct. Having said that, a lot of it is a performance because we are constantly performing our gender. Whether we are doing it deliberately or not, I'm willing to bet that most of us in this room, most of us in the world, pick our clothes in part based on how people will perceive us, in part based on how they will perceive our gender presentation. Not only, but even when we say, well, I don't care, I'm just going to wear what I want, that's still recognizing that part of how people are perceiving us is based on how we present, and even if we choose not to engage in that, we're still thinking about it. Most of us, most of the time. But gender is also a performance because it really only counts, for the people who are trying to be in the box, it really just counts when you make it visible. I was getting off the train several months ago, and I was watching these two guys, maybe early 20s or so, and they were getting into some sort of fight. I don't know what it was about. I really don't care what it was about, but what was fascinating to me was that watching them go back and forth, and then they both did this. Just like a cat raising its hackles, just like a dog growling. It was a performance of gender. It was, let me make myself bigger to try to scare. Anybody else ever seen this, or been on the receiving end of this, or maybe done it yourself? Yeah, so that's what I mean by a performance. The other piece about it, though, is that it is a hierarchy. Because only the guy, only the guy up at the top is the quote-unquote real man. And then you've got all of these guys underneath who are varying degrees of real manitude. And then you've got the ones at the bottom who are getting shoved out of the box. And in my experience, I think this goes a long way to help explain why, for example, groups of men tend to catcall women much more than individual men. Not that individual men don't do it, but groups of men tend to do it more. Because the guy at the bottom of the box, he's the one who's going to be taking crap at the end of it all. So he has to escalate it. And that means that now the new guy at the bottom has to escalate, and so it increases. For that matter, sexual assaults and physical assaults tends to be more violent when it's a group perpetrating than when it's an individual, because it's hierarchical. Because nobody wants to be the one at the bottom of the heap, if you believe in the box. There is a difference in the way that this plays out among gay men and men who have sex with men, in part because the dynamics are different. Because then you get, two guys who are both in the box or struggling with it at the same time. And I've talked with plenty of gay men who find exactly that. That there's a piece of them that wants to be in the box, but there's a piece of them that knows that they're not in the box, and it's a real challenge. As far as the hyper-masculinity piece, there are a lot of threads to that as well. But you're right. I mean, if you think about how many guys spend all of their time at the gym in order to look big and huge so that they will be able to get laid more. And that's a really strong reinforcement for sticking in the box. And I do think that you're right. Sometimes how that plays out is, well, I know that I'm not going to be in the box because of this, so let me try to amp it up over there. I was chatting with a friend of mine once who was definitely working with a lot of this kind of thing, and he turned to me and said that, the day that he found real freedom was the day that he realized that he could both, rewire his kitchen and then bake a cake in it. And, that he could do that, and that was great. And that was when he realized, I don't have to reject it over here, I don't have to reject it over there. I can hold on to both. And I'd love to see more gay men embrace that, because I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
And also being able to express their femininity sexually and get sexual pleasure out of being able to play with gender and being more fluid about the concept of gender and sexuality. Because we get so rigid and we can't enjoy ourselves. We don't allow ourselves to enjoy ourselves. And it's rooted in that.
There's a fascinating book on the topic. It's a little dry. I'd like to. I believe it was somebody's dissertation, so I think it could be spruced up a bit. But it's called Fairies, Bears, and Leathermen, and it's a look at 3 different subcultures within the gay community that find different ways to navigate the tension between being male and the overarching stereotype of gay equals feminine. And different strategies that each community has adopted for that. It's worth reading, for sure.
I'm curious, this is a topic that resonates powerfully with me. It's been a huge issue for myself. But I understand kind of how men reinforce, the box with other men in social groups. I understand how parents reinforce it. I haven't heard much about how women reinforce or reward or that. I didn't know if you were going there.
Yes, definitely. So in terms of how women reinforce it, absolutely. There are. It's interesting because I have talked with a lot of women who say, on the one hand, well, I want a guy who's sensitive and can talk about his feelings, and then when she meets him, oh, well, he's too nice. And how do we manage? And in some ways, what this is creating for men is a different version of the virgin slut dichotomy. You've got the nice guy, bad boy dichotomy. Or when I hear men talk about wanting to find a female partner who is, a lady in the streets and a slut in the streets, I hear the same thing with men. I want him to be a nice guy until we get into bed. And it creates a real tension there. And I've talked with plenty of men who say things like, well, but I don't want to do those things because, for guys who are struggling with the difference between S&M and abuse, for example, they don't know how to navigate that. That's a real tension. And one of the things that makes it challenging for a lot of men who are trying to break down the box is having women in their lives who are trying to push them back in, sometimes because the women in their lives have a view of the guy in the box as protector, provider, father figure, daddy, whatever it is. There's all different versions. And if he is no longer going to do that, suddenly the world is a scarier place.
Well, isn't that just that's a woman's natural instinct? They need a provider, a protector, don't you? That's a natural instinct, don't you think?
I don't think I think that's a natural instinct for anybody under the age of 12.
Okay.
But I think there is a natural instinct to, as you said, to know that you don't have to be the one driving the car all the time.
Now,
But
yeah, please.
no to you and yes to you.
Well, yeah, I mean, I do think there's a natural instinct there for people generally. I mean, when we're little, I just picked 12 out of my head. You know, developmental psychologists might disagree with me on the exact number.
Yeah.
But sure, what happens is boys get pushed out of the nest too early, and girls don't get taught how to leave the nest. So so what happens when we're adults is a lot of women don't know how to stand on their own 2 feet as powerful people because they haven't learned the skills to do it. And because that looks very similar to the way that little kids deal with it, it often looks like a natural instinct. But I think we need to find that middle ground for everybody. I think we need to provide more care and safeguarding for boys and also teach girls how to stand on their own 2 feet. That would be a lovely world to live in. I look forward to the day when we can do that. I want to talk a little bit more about some of the effects of the box, though, because I think that's, and then we'll circle back to that piece. Some of the ways, I don't think this is an exhaustive list, but some of the ways that I see the box affect people's lives. One is that a lot of men simply can't talk about our feelings. Everybody has feelings. We have different feelings, and our capacities and what feelings we experience varies tremendously. I don't think everybody has the same feelings in every situation. Another thing that Marty was talking about yesterday is when couples come to see him in therapy, and one of them will say, well, he's not very emotional. What's actually frequently going on there is he hasn't learned the skills to talk about his emotions, and so his anxiety about being outside the box keeps him from expressing them. Boys don't learn how to talk about our feelings because it gets shamed out of us. Except for anger. We're allowed to express anger. We're not allowed to express fear or shame or worry or these other kinds of emotions that exist simply as a result of being human beings. And I think everybody here in this room probably can think of 5 or 10 ways in which that really messes up our relationships. Not the least of which is you can't get what you want until you ask for it. Because other people can't read minds. It also creates a performance model of sexuality. Get it hard, get it in, get it off. And it's interesting because we hear a lot about male sexual performance and we hear a lot about Viagra, and yet we don't hear much about men's sexual pleasure. It's just assumed that if you can stick it in somewhere and have an ejaculation, you enjoyed yourself. I'm willing to bet that everybody here with a penis that has had that kind of sex has had sexual experiences that felt kind of like a sneeze. Like, oh, okay, well, at least I don't feel that tension anymore, but it wasn't really mind-blowing. Anybody here besides me had that experience? There you go. Because when we focus more on performance, we lose out on the pleasure. I've had this sort of thought experiment. I've been meaning to do a survey for a while, an anonymous survey of men. If you could choose between 2 different pills, one that would cause you to have an erection whenever you wanted, for as long as you wanted, but that you would only feel, say, 50% of the possible pleasure, and another pill that would make you feel twice as much pleasure as usual, but you would get an erection only 50% of the time, which one would you choose? And where would the decisions change based on where we peg those numbers? I'm willing to bet that for many men, they would rather have less pleasure and bigger, harder cocks, simply because of the performance model of sex. I feel confident about that, which is why I've never actually done the survey. I've been meaning to. Another way that this affects or creates a performance model of sex, though, anybody ever seen this picture? I hate this picture. This picture infuriates me for 2 reasons. One is that it portrays women's sexuality as this vastly complicated thing that you need to have an engineering degree to be able to master. Now, I get that for many people, sex has challenges. I think a lot of why women's sexuality is challenging for a lot of people is lack of education and shame and fear. But this idea that for men, hey, all you got to do is look at somebody hot and bam, you've got an erection and bam, you're ready to have sex right then. And I talk to men quite frequently who feel like failures because they want to be able to tell their partner, you know, I'm just not in the mood. I had a busy day at work and I'm tired. But this idea that you should just be able to switch it on. So coming back to your question about how women play into this, for sure, I hear that from a lot of women too, that who just expect that, you know, by putting on the sexy lingerie, that he's supposed to want to have sex and be able to have sex in a particular way, and then shame him when that doesn't happen. And shame does not actually support happy sex lives.
No, I was just going to add that the breakthrough that I had that helped me realize the box to start stepping out of it was ironically taking a blood pressure medicine to let me unable to get hard, not understanding why, and allowing myself to experience pleasure in other ways that I wouldn't allow myself previously. So it was kind of ironic in retrospect that that's what, you know, helped me overcome it.
Absolutely. I talked with quite a few men who, because of blood pressure medications or other kinds of medications, it shifts sexual response. And so finding, for some men, it becomes a question of, or the question that gets them to talk to me is, do cock rings fix this? Will Viagra fix this? And sometimes there's an opportunity there to say, well, you know, there's lots of other things you can do. It's not just about this one part of the body. So mazel tov, that's awesome. That's fantastic. And I wish more men would be able to do that. So yeah, this idea of how sex works, it just infuriates me. Plus, it means that men tend to only have one kind of sex. And Joe Kramer, the founder of the Body Electric School, he has a great line. We don't eat the same kinds of food at 40 as we do at 14, so why are we masturbating the same way? I take that in a slightly different direction, which is, you know, for so many men, we go our entire lives having one kind of sex. And, you know, that would be like eating at the same restaurant every day of your life. There's a huge variety available to you. And wouldn't it be nice to just, you know, take that panel off and see what other wiring is actually there? There's a lot more fun that way. It's another reason why we wrote the book on prostate play, actually. We want to get more men feeling good. Other effects of the box. Well, I talked quite a bit about the performance model of masculinity. It turns it into something for other people to see rather than being an authentic expression of who you are. And I don't want to sidetrack by getting into the question of what does authenticity really mean, and isn't everything a performance? I think everything is an interplay between authenticity and performance. I would like to see that mix shift a little bit more in the other direction. Interestingly, believing in the box is inside the box. The guy who's inside the box is invested in seeing it as an essential truth about himself or about men or about masculinity. And that is one of the reasons why this is so resistant to change. Because as soon as I or another guy starts talking about this stuff, we've put ourselves outside the box in the view of the guy who's in it. And then he stops listening to us. There actually, did any of you see the TED Talk? I forget the guy's name, but the man box,
yeah.
That guy, do you remember his name?
I don't remember his name. Great talk.
Yeah, it was a great talk. And I think part of why he is so successful doing this work is because physically he's a big, muscular dude. He looks like he's in the box. He looks like a football player. I don't know if he was or not, I forget. He has an advantage doing this work that I don't. Because already, even before I open my mouth, people don't necessarily see me inside the box. Depends on what I'm wearing. But once I start talking about it, the guys who are invested in it often don't continue to hear it. And I mention that because I would really like to invite all of you to engage in some of this work, because you may have inroads to some people or some communities that I don't, and I would really like to see that happen. I also want to mention sensitive new age guys, snags. Let me come out of the closet here. I used to be a snag. Actually, if you friend me on Facebook, you'll see there's a photo of me from college with long curly hair down to about here. I was a hippie. I was a hippie, sensitive new age guy. And what that meant for me, and what I see how that plays out for a lot of guys, is I'm not going to express anger and whatever you want, sweetie, and no, you go first, and I don't want to be anything inside the box, and I'm never going to tell you what I want. Because men spend so much time doing all of those things that are inside the box. I don't want to be any of that. What I came to see after a while, however, is that if you can't do something because of the box, you're just as trapped as the person who has to do it because of the box. You're just as trapped. So who raised the question about picking and choosing? Somebody said something about that earlier. That's where we start to see the shift. For a long time, I couldn't be anything that was inside that box. And that sucked. That was awful. It was an important part of my process in moving past it, but it wasn't actually letting go of the box because I was still trapped by it. And yeah, so we'll circle back to that. I think it's worth mentioning, though, that not everything in the box is bad. I don't want to give everything in the box a kick in the teeth and throw it out the door. There's nothing wrong with liking sports or being a provider or enjoying being a car mechanic, or if you like to be an athlete and you run marathons or you lift weights, if it makes you genuinely happy, go for it. The problem is when we do it because we're doing it for somebody else versus doing it for ourselves. And this is where we get into that question of authenticity versus performance. And I'm seeing those conversations happen in a lot of different places. One thing for me that helps me figure out if I'm doing something for myself or as a performance is I stop and ask myself, am I interested in doing this if nobody else in the world knows about it? If nobody else knows, and that helps me tease that out. Granted, we do also internalize our critics and our shamers and all of that as well. So that's not a be-all, end-all to this. But is it authentic? Does it support you? But not everything in the box is bad. What I want to get rid of is the box itself, not everything that's inside of it. I think that's the trick. That's the challenge. So what do we do about that? Well, first off, and this is especially for men and people who have partners or friends or family members or housemates or co-workers or anyone else in their lives who are men, which is most people, although not quite everybody in the world. Talking about emotions takes a lot of practice. And as anybody who has raised kids or spent time around kids knows, when we teach kids colors, we don't teach them the entire spectrum of the rainbow. What we teach them is red, yellow, blue. We keep it basic. It doesn't matter if it's royal blue, if it's robin's egg blue, if it's sky blue, if it's any of these other many, many shades of blue. It's just blue because they're not ready for those advanced colors yet. And as we get older, if we have interest, we can start learning about this. That there's a whole bunch of other different colors out there in the world. Although, interestingly enough, I really like this metaphor. I do think it's worth acknowledging that the majority of people in the world who are colorblind are men and have difficulty seeing this image. I just want to acknowledge that. So talking about emotions takes a lot of practice. And when I work with men around this, and when therapist colleagues of mine are working with men around this, we often find that it's important to just keep it really basic. It doesn't matter if you're worried, if you're scared, if you're anxious, if you're panicked, if you're nervous. Call it fear. I notice you're noticing I notice you look like you're feeling some fear around this. Just label it that. That's the red, the yellow, blue version of that conversation. And over time, as somebody gains capacity, we can start getting into some of those more subtle gradations. It takes practice. And here's another way in which this plays out differently for men interacting with women, although I do see this in other relationship dynamics as well. Most women have years and years and years of practice talking about feelings and often don't understand that the men in their lives are still at the red, yellow, blue level. We can get there. It just takes practice. It takes practice to be able to recognize what I'm feeling, to be able to put it into words in a way that somebody else can hear without getting sucked into my own emotions and without getting trapped by my triggers. That takes a lot of practice. And if you have skill at that, regardless of your own gender, if you have skill at that and you're talking to somebody who does not, I ask you to bring some compassion to that, because judging them for it would be like a gourmet chef judging somebody who's just bought their first cookbook. It's not fair, and it doesn't help.
What I've noticed in working with my patients is the Latino men who are less acculturated,
Yeah.
maybe come from the countries of origin, the word fear is difficult for them to even own.
Yeah.
And the more acculturated men, second, third, fourth generation Latinos, it's much easier for them to identify that and be okay with accepting fear as part of their emotional spectrum.
You're right. Being able to acknowledge our fears is tricky for a lot of people. You're talking about often first generation Latino men, although not only, but being scared is outside the box.
Right.
So yeah, you're absolutely right. There is a piece of that. Is there a word that does resonate for them? Does worry or does concern or?
Ansiedad, anxious.
Yeah.
Or preocupación, which is worry. Yeah.
Yeah. So sometimes finding another synonym is getting the door open.
And I didn't realize that as a Latino man, I went in and I was directly translating from English to Spanish when I first started working with Spanish monolingual patients. And then I noticed that I kept getting resistance every time I brought up miedo,
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, that's it. So then I just I did that shift.
Right, so
I didn't know until I knew.
Finding the word
Right.
to get that in. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That's great. Yes, it takes a lot of practice. And it's a long process, but just like anything else we practice, bit by bit we get there, and then 5 years later you look back and you realize, wow, wait a minute, I've gotten good at this. But when you're at the start of it, it looks like a huge journey. One step at a time and all of that. It's such a cliche. Isn't it annoying sometimes how the cliches are actually true? One step at a time, journey of 1,000 miles, and yeah. All right, other things we can do. This is one that I find personally very challenging, which is how to offer support without taking somebody else's stuff on. Especially if it's somebody who we love or care very strongly for. Men need everyone around us to stop coddling our difficulties around us. There's a balance between supporting somebody and coddling somebody.
Give me an example.
Well, I'm sorry, so coddling would be so as an example, coddling would be if you get upset because we're talking about something, so I avoid talking about the topic entirely. I know that my partner is upset because he's having erection difficulties, so I'm not going to talk with him about it because I don't want him to feel bad. Whenever we say, I don't want you to feel bad, well, actually, let me rephrase. Whenever I choose what to do based on, quote, I don't want you to feel bad, that's coddling somebody. I want to respect your strength enough that you will be able to handle what I have to bring you. So that's the difference between support and coddling. It's what can I do to help you rather than what can I do to avoid your hurt feelings or your difficult feelings. Yeah, thank you. So offering support without taking it on. And that is often a very tricky thing for women because a lot of women have learned to take on the emotional care and maintenance of their male partners and family members. Oh, well, your father loves you, he just doesn't know how to express it. That's coddling. Buy him a copy of The 5 Love Languages, which, I just as an aside, it's a fantastic book if you can get past his insistence on heterosexual monogamous marriage within a Christian context. The information in it is great, and it will help. If you haven't, has anybody here read it? Lots of you have read it. If you have not read it, it will help you hack your emotional operating system. It's a brilliant book. Just know that is this particular guy's focus.
I'm sorry, what was the title?
The 5 Love Languages by Gary Chapman.
I just want to add, when you put two men together
Yeah.
who are unable to talk about their emotions in a relationship,
Damn.
It can become very difficult. And I think that there's a myth around gay men being attuned to their feelings, and we are emotive and we know how to talk from that emotional place or have emotional intelligence. And we all come from that box.
Yeah.
So you put two men together, and a lot of times it's distortion.
It's an interesting thing. I'm going to say something that is a huge stereotype that I have also seen play out quite often, which is that you put two men together, and quite often neither knows how to start the conversation about emotions, If you put two women together, often neither knows how to start the conversation about sex. And vice versa. It's no one people have difficulty being the first one out on the dance floor. And I know that that's a huge sweeping statement, obviously not true for everybody. It is true often enough that the patterns play out. Yeah, absolutely. And so it gets tricky because, if I step forward and tell you how I'm feeling, you might attack me.
Right.
If you step forward, I might attack you, or maybe, you'll say something, I'll get triggered and freak out. I mean, it just bounces back and forth. So some other things. So I'm a big fan of men's groups. I think it's really valuable for men to get a chance to talk about this stuff in our own spaces. It does require skillful facilitation, because what you're talking about, where nobody wants to be the first one to say something, when you've got 8 or 10 guys and everybody's just sitting there, it takes skillful work. Not all men's groups are really supportive of breaking down the box, but more and more are. A lot of this, I think it's also important to avoid gender essentialism. I do think that there are things that are wired into biology. There are trends based on gender. On average, men are taller than women. On the other hand, I know a lot of women who are taller than me. But statistically speaking, men are taller than women. Men have more muscle mass than women, statistically speaking. But we also need to be really careful to remember that those are statistical trends and not accurate statements of everybody's experience. So, avoiding gender essentialism is a big one, and I go back and forth with a lot of people who do a lot of work around sexual politics, around that in particular. Other stuff that we can do, I'm a big fan of sex positivity for this, because in my view, sex positivity is the notion that the only thing that's relevant about, the only relevant measure of a sexual act or practice is the consent, pleasure, and well-being of the people who do it and the people who are affected by it. I know that was a big chunk. I've written a lot about it on my website, so I don't want to get sidetracked by that. But the reason why I mention it here is because sex positivity can help us see that there are many ways to be sexual, that there are many ways to enjoy pleasure, to enjoy our bodies, and we don't need to focus on this one particular thing. And that can be a way to open up that door to breaking down the box. Big fan of that. I also geek out a lot about language. Many of you are probably well familiar with using gender-neutral language. I try to not use gender pronouns or terms unless it is relevant to the conversation. Like I'm talking about a particular person who has a particular gender preference or pronoun choice. I just don't talk about gender. I don't say this guy in front of me at the supermarket. I'll say the person in front of me at the supermarket. It takes a lot of practice, and people do sometimes look at me funny, but I don't know what their gender identity is. And I've known way too many people who look one way and identify another way to really feel comfortable assuming I know what somebody's gender identity is. Plus, the more we step outside of gendered language, the easier it is to break down these either-or categories. Also a big fan of some, many, most. There has not yet been any, I've been studying sex for about 20 years, academically studying sex for about 20 years, professionally. And I have not yet found anything that is true for everybody, at all. So when I hear people say things like men do this, women enjoy that, I take them with a grain of salt. Some men enjoy this, a lot of women say that. That's a true statement, or it might be a true statement. But there's nothing all or nothing about sexuality or sex or gender. And so I try to avoid saying things like, well, men do these kinds of things. I might say many men or most men. It does make it harder for me to create sound bites and good book titles. I'm not going to be able to write most men are from Mars, but some are from Venus. That's just not going to sell. That's the tension. But I refuse to give up on the possibility of finding. It's really a question of right speech. Am I speaking rightly? So some, many, most. And challenging language that polices gender. I really, I dislike when people talk about people or genders or events or anything that reinforces this idea that there's only one way to be male and only one way to be female. And that everybody is one or the other. It's just not true. So I try to call it out when I see it. And that helps break down the box. This is a really nice quote. The thought becomes the word becomes the deed becomes habit hardens into character. When we change how we think and how we talk, it eventually starts to filter out into how we act, and then it becomes who we are. And so where we can start is right up there at the top. What is our language choice around this? What are we doing with this? And really, truly, I have found over time that it has shifted who I am in the world. And in fact, I find that a much easier way to change how I move through the world than to beat myself up for saying things or to beat myself up for not being perfect or for anything else. I find this a much more self-compassionate way to take responsibility for this. So I invite you to try that for yourself. I think it's time that we recognize that there's just a lot more gender diversity out there in the world. It's not an either or. And we gotta stop pretending that it is, and breaking down the box is a piece of that. There are many, many different genders, many different physical sexes, many different ways of interacting with all of this. And it doesn't need to be scary. It really doesn't need to be scary. We can choose to let it be scary, or we can choose to get over ourselves. I'll let you guess for yourself which one I've chosen to do. And I invite you to do the same. And having said that, as hegemonic and overarching and as all of this feels, things really do change. Definitions of masculinity have changed over time. They will continue to change over time. And 100 years from now, 500 years from now, folks will hopefully be looking back at us and saying, well, gosh, they were doing this thing back then that they didn't even recognize. And now we don't even do that because we know blah, blah, blah. This stuff will change. We may not see it in our lifetimes, but have faith. It really will. Please do get in touch. I would love to hear from any of you, thoughts, comments, questions, feedback. And thank you, everyone.